Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the TAPED podcast, the most paranoid podcast in the world. I'm your host, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, MickyT.
Hell yeah! You
And
didn't even say your name, bud.
Did I not say I'm nostalgia?
No, you did not.
Oh shit, I'm nostalgia. As
Holy
always.
That's a bit of an oxymoron because your name is nostalgia, yet you're forgetting.
Here.
Well,
Well, Mick, do you want to introduce the band that we will be talking about today?
Oh yes. First official worst best of 2020, and this is exciting. So, the band that we're going to be covering is probably the most influential band in heavy metal history, and they're pretty much the godfathers of the genre. And I mean, you already know from the title, we're just going to be talking about Black Sabbath.
Ooh.
And we're ranking their entire discography from worst to best. We've decided that we're going to be ranking 19 Black Sabbath albums from worst to best. No comps, no EPs, no albums under a different band name. I know there was one with Dio that they didn't like 2009 that we decided to cut out. But I think we're happy with what we have here. 19 albums. And there's a lot to cover here, so we'll just get right into it. So, you ready?
Yeah. This may be
Right.
the longest one so far, so I will also mention that we will be keeping things brief for some of the bottom entries and the middle entries, and the top of the pack is really where it's at and where we'll be putting more of our attention towards.
Yeah, of course. And with that in mind, let's start at number 19. Black Sabbath's worst album, and in my opinion, it's Born Again.
In my opinion, it's 7th Star.
God, I fucking hate looking at the album cover for Born Again. Jesus Christ. So yeah, Born Again. Now, up until this point in the Black Sabbath discography, I personally think that they hadn't made a bad album yet. You know, they made some subpar albums, absolutely, but not one that was just straight up bad. Well, Born Again is well and truly like the first huge stinker in the band's discography chronologically, and you know, that was for a few reasons. Now, firstly, just a bit of context. At this point in the band's career, you know, they went through two vocalists. They had Ozzy and Dio. And this album saw the first and only appearance of Ian Gillan from Deep Purple. And the reason why he joined Sabbath for one album was because, unbeknownst to him, Tony Iommi got him to sign a contract saying that he would while he was drunk. And also because this album was just so shameful that he never came back. Born Again is just a mess from front to back. It's an album that's just so annoying and grating, but it's just also just drab and boring simultaneously. It's annoying because the production is consistently abysmal across the entire album, and Ian Gillan is just so grating to listen to throughout the whole album. His howling is so painful, honestly, and I can't deal with it, honestly. Also, it's boring because the performances and the instrumentals are just so dry and lifeless, especially on the less heavier songs, and you know, at that point the album just becomes this really bland, boring and monotonous slog that's just soul-sucking. I wouldn't even say there's a single good song on the album. There's some okay ones, but there's a lot of really bad to mediocre ones. I won't say Ian Gillan is a totally awful vocalist, but he just sounds so awkward on this album especially, so that's just a slate to him on this record, I guess. Yeah. Just to cap it off, Born Again is uninspired, it's a mess, and there's a reason why this is the last Black Sabbath album Bill Ward was ever on.
I went with 7th Star. On this project, Black Sabbath just go full-on, shameless, adult-oriented rock, and in my opinion, this is where they've released their most flavourless and bland collection of tracks ever. This project is just such a slog, a painful slog to sit through. And honestly, there's just nothing really of value here. It doesn't sound like a Black Sabbath album, really. It doesn't really even deserve the band's title. It's clearly a product of what was popular on, you know, radios, on rock radios in the mid-80s. Nothing more, nothing less. Sure, adult-oriented rock isn't always bad. It's just mostly bad. And this project really brings out a lot of the worst that the genre has to offer. The guitar work just is sterile as fuck. The vocals and lyrics are so cheesy it hurts. Yeah, and the vocals just don't really portray any passion or any real life. It's just It's so boring. It's so sterile. It's so predictable. The track "No Stranger to Love" genuinely sounds like it was written and performed by like a bunch of lifeless, joyless robots. There's just nothing to like about this album, in my opinion.
Yeah. Best track on Born Again is Stonehenge. The worst track is Digital Bitch.
I don't have any favorites on Seventh Star, but my least favorite tracks are "No Stranger to Love," "Heart Like a Wheel," and "Angry Heart."
Alright, we're going to move on to number 18, and I chose Forbidden.
I also chose Forbidden.
The last Black Sabbath album that was released with Tony Martin, and just what a fucking unremarkable way to send him off. Maybe there's a couple of riffs and drum parts here and there that are actually somewhat decent on Forbidden, but outside of that, not much else really. And I just have to mention how fucking dead the production makes everything sound on here. It's so sterile, like, it just makes everything feel so weak, and it's just so... it does nothing for the music, even if the music barely had anything going on to begin with. In my opinion, like, Tony Martin is probably like my least favorite Black Sabbath vocalist, to be honest, and it's simply because he added nothing interesting to the band's sound at this point, and he just kind of overstayed his welcome. And the only thing that's really memorable about Forbidden is the fact that for some reason Ice-T appears in the first track to do some fucking spoken word. Like, that's literally it. Outside of that, this album made me catch the fattest Z's known to man because it's just so boring and so flavorless.
Yeah, I'm talking about the same one. It's perhaps surprising to some of our viewers that we have this album up this high, considering a lot of people seem to scream from the rooftops that this is by far the worst thing Sabbath have ever released. And it's definitely not hard to see why. This thing is genuinely unlistenable at times. Some of the riffs here are just on fucking life support. That riff in the opening track, Jesus Christ, I have never heard a metal guitar riff sound so pathetic and sad. And the Ice-T feature really doesn't really do much to save that track. But even beyond the opening track, everything this album has to offer just doesn't work, in my opinion. And in my opinion, a lot of this album doesn't even really try to work. It's just blatant to me that this album was just put together and shit out with no rhyme or reason. There's no passion, there's no heart here. The production is just awful. It was clearly very rushed. And yeah, it's just... It would have been an embarrassing moment in most bands' discography, but if the band holds as much prestige as Black Sabbath does, it's just a little... it adds a little insult to injury.
Well and truly. Best track on Forbidden, well, quote-unquote best track, is Sick and Tired. The absolute worst track is Forbidden.
Oh, my favourite track is Forbidden. My least favourite track is The Illusion of Power.
Alright, moving on to number 17. I chose Cross Purposes.
I chose Born Again.
Cross Purposes is another one of the many late era Black Sabbath albums that I just have so little to say about because it just presents so little that's notable or interesting to take away from it. Like, Jesus Christ, I was so bored listening to this album. It felt more like an hour and a half rather than 47 minutes. The production is pretty much what I'd expect from late-era Black Sabbath. Just bland, 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 bland. It adds nothing to the instrumentation when the instrumentation is just so overly sterile and just kind of shitted out with, like, little, like, just passion or anything. Like, it's incredibly boring in the riff department. The drumming was fine on a few tracks, but aside from that, nothing else stands out about it. Tony Martin returned again for this one, and, he's just as forgettable as he's been on previous Black Sabbath efforts. Like, he sounds fine, but he just doesn't give a performance that's memorable or interesting. I didn't enjoy a single track from this album in the slightest. Barely anything about this was memorable or interesting. It's just another bland attempt from Black Sabbath, and it's honestly just sad in how utterly nondescript and uninteresting it is. There's just so little to say about it. It's a bad album, in my opinion. It has nothing worthwhile from it. Let's just move on.
Well. Born Again. What can I say? In my opinion, the band were already kind of on a steady, but not drastic decline before the release of this album. But what on earth happened here? I'll start with Ian Gillan because, obviously I'm not deaf. He is a very good vocalist, but there's no one in the world that can convince me that he doesn't sound out of place on this album. The entire dynamic of the band here is just so messy, so unrefined. Things just don't click at any point. But my God, the worst aspect of this album for me personally has to be the production. It genuinely sounds like parts of this album were recorded underwater. I don't know how you can achieve this, like, this bad of a production style without trying to do it on purpose. And I don't see why you'd ever want to make an album sound this bad on purpose. It's just, I guess it just sounds like it was recorded on really bad equipment or something, but it just makes things so much worse. But yeah, overall, this is just another dud in Black Sabbath's discography, and one that definitely is particularly just unique for the wrong reasons because of how fucking dog the production sounds and how out of place Ian Gillan sounds.
Yeah. Best track on Cross Purposes is Cross of Thorns. My least favorite track is Cardinal Sin.
My favorite tracks, favorites in fucking
massive quotation marks.
Yeah. Tracks on Born Again is Born Again, which is an okay song, I guess. Worst tracks, Zero to Hero for sure. Maybe my least favorite Black Sabbath track, and Digital Bitch.
Digital Bitch is probably my least favorite Black Sabbath track. Well, okay, we're moving on to number 16, and I chose The Eternal Idol.
I also chose The Eternal Idol.
The Eternal Idol, once again, is just a very, very, very poor, nondescript album in Black Sabbath's later years, and while I don't think it's bad, I just have very little to say about it, like a lot of late-era Black Sabbath albums. This is just... it's such a nothing album. It's the first one that they did with Tony Martin, and this, much like the album that came before it, 7 Star, is just very much a dated bit of 80s, like, adult-oriented rock pastiche, and unfortunately, it's just as boring, predictable, and at times just straight-up cheesy as it was on 7 Star. This album is just inoffensive at what it does. Like, it does nothing more outside of some okay riffs and some decent vocal performances, since everything else about it is just forgettable as hell. Like, it's hard to even say it has standout moments because it, well and truly, doesn't have any. The band, once again, just does nothing that excites or causes any enjoyment, but rather it just continues to make the bland and uninteresting hard rock, like, just get drilled into my fucking head because of how just so nondescript, wishy-washy, and boring it is. Like, man. It's literally just they're following the trends and just shitting out whatever they could just because they can. And yeah, like I said, there isn't much to say about this album other than that it exists and it does nothing else but exist.
Yeah, I mean, you've pretty much said everything there is to say. There isn't a whole lot to say. One thing I will say in favor of The Eternal Idol is that it certainly somewhat resembles the Black Sabbath you'll find on earlier projects. However, it is a very, very watered down and very predictable version of that Black Sabbath and that same energy. There's some subtle callbacks to their early doomy atmosphere, but I still think the album just largely falls flat across the board. Vocally, I think it's serviceable from Tony Martin, nothing more, nothing stand out. Guitar work again has some great and memorable moments, but largely it just reads like hard rock pastiche. And the rest of the instrumentation doesn't really do much of note at all. It's not very good at all, but I wouldn't say it's bad like the previous 3 albums.
Hard rock AOR pastiche, I wasn't meant to say, but by the way. Quote unquote best track is probably Lost Forever. The worst track is Ancient Warrior.
That's interesting because the only track I liked was Ancient Warrior. Least favorite track was Born to Lose.
Okay. Moving on to number 15, I chose Headless Cross.
I chose Mob Rules.
that stings for me, but whatever. Right, Headless Cross, I don't have much to say about it again, since I'd pretty much be repeating myself when talking about most of Black Sabbath's post-Ozzy and Dio output, but just to have something to say, Headless Cross is just another helping of incredibly average, really boring and generic 80s metal. I guess Tony Martin sounds better on this album than he did on some of the other albums, but that doesn't really make much of a difference since this album once again just feels so dated and uninteresting. It's just the lads coming together and doing nothing outstanding once more. They decided, let's just make another really monotonous, bland and uninteresting metal album, which they proceeded to do, and vice versa. It tries to go for a darker vibe in some areas, but it just doesn't feel dark sonically. In fact, it's just really boring. The riffs from Tony Iommi are decent for the most part, and the solos are fine, but that's really it. It's just very stale, and the production is just so generic and grossly 80s. It doesn't really appeal to me. It's very dated, and I guess I just have nothing more to say besides that. It's just another dated Black Sabbath album that is just very boring, very unmemorable. Let's just move on.
I went with Mob Rules, and honestly, I don't have a lot to say here. It's just another one of Black Sabbath's albums that I just find to be quite boring and nondescript. Dio's vocals are really the only saving grace for me on this album, and even then it doesn't exactly save the album and the music on here from being just a boring slog to me. It's instrumentally just very sterile. It's completely devoid of any of the memorable songwriting, that made Black Sabbath's better works so memorable. And it just, again, falls flat in a lot of different aspects. I will say, though, that the title track is certainly very, very solid. Again, it does really feel like a diamond in the rough, though, when a lot of the material on here is just really boring to me.
Fair enough, I guess. Alright, quote-unquote, best track on Headless Cross is Nightwing. Worst track is Call of the Wild.
My favourite track on Mob Rules is The Mob Rules, and my least favourite track is Falling Off the Edge of the World.
Right, moving on to our number 14 picks, and I chose Never Say Die.
I also chose Never Say Die.
And here we have, for me at least, when we're going in chronologically, the first big dud in Black Sabbath's discography. Not that Never Say Die is a bad album, but it's just another Black Sabbath album that I find myself so indifferent towards, and that's simply because Never Say Die is just pretty damn boring, unmemorable, and very forgettable. There are things I can give it credit for, like I like its unexpected embrace of some jazz rock sounds in the latter half of the album, and it sounds fine and decently produced most of the time, but there's just a lot of moments here that just feel very watered down, half-baked and bland. The band watered down their sound into more bland hard rock territories with a few exceptions. The instrumentation sounds fine for the most part, and Tony Iommi is still doing his thing with his guitar work, but not a single riff or melody is memorable to me. Plus, I've probably forgotten what a majority of these tracks even sound like by now. Ozzy is pretty hit or miss on this album as well. His vocals don't really hit on here. Most of the time he sounds like he's kind of doing a chore rather than performing with much enthusiasm. Also, I bet you didn't even remember Bill Ward had another fucking vocal track. Yeah, all of this pretty much just makes Never Say Die, in my opinion, the worst Ozzy era Black Sabbath album. I want to say more, but there isn't much to say. Never Say Die, it's just there, and there's nothing more to analyze.
Yeah, Never Say Die sees the band's passion and the magic that made their first batch of albums so memorable. It takes that magic and it sees it, die. Ozzy is just phoning things in. He sounds so lethargic on this thing. He does not sound like he wants to be there. And the rest of the band just displays no real passion, no intensity, and no real signs of actually wanting to make music anymore, at least with Ozzy at the helm. It just really just reeks of, again, metal and hard rock pastiche, and is overall a very disappointing send-off to Ozzy, who doesn't even sound like he wants to be there.
Alright, so my favourite tracks on Never Say Die are Breakout and Air Dance. The worst track is Johnny Blade.
Again, my favourite track and the only really standout for me was Johnny Blade.
What?
My least favourite tracks are Swinging the Chain.
Man, Johnny Blade is terrible. What? My voice! For fuck's sake.
Keeping things spicy, man.
Ah well. Okay, next up, number 13, Unlucky 13. I chose 7 Star.
I chose... God, I scrolled too far. I chose Cross Purposes.
7 Star wasn't actually meant to be a Black Sabbath album when it was made. It was meant to be the first Tony Iommi solo album, but he was forced to release it under the Black Sabbath name at the time, and there may be and honestly, I guess there may be a couple of redeeming qualities about 7 Star, but as a whole, it isn't that good, and it sticks out like a sore thumb in Black Sabbath's discography. The sound is completely detached from the sounds that we expect from a Black Sabbath album. Like, it's going for this 80s hard rock sound akin to, say, like Van Halen, and while the production might be pretty solid, it feels really derivative for what it is, and it's pretty much a product of its time in many respects. I guess this is actually just a bit of lore. This is the first Black Sabbath album to feature Jeff Nichols, who would be primary keyboardist for years to come. And on the vocal front, the album has another former Deep Purple singer, Glenn Hughes, who honestly sounds fine when suits the music well, but you know, a lot of the music is really cheesy as well as the songwriting. It's just not great, that to say the least. I mean, I really liked a few tracks on here for the most part, and a lot of them just... But for the most part, a lot of them just sounded really derivative, plain, and just overly commercial. Like, after listening to this album, I could barely remember most of it. Even from the tracks I thought were decent. I mean, fair enough if it wasn't meant to be for a Black Sabbath album, but hey, it is what it is, I suppose.
So I went for Cross Purposes. It's an album that kind of, I feel like, represents the kind of middle of the pack section of this worst to best for me. It doesn't really do anything truly awful, but again, it doesn't really do anything truly spectacular either. It's really hard to see any of, you know, the drive or passion that, you know, in my opinion, a lot of time carries metal projects. And same goes for a lot of the technicality and the excitement and the memorability of the music. It just really isn't present here. It's a little too safe and predictable, and it is definitely a hint, in my opinion, that the band's, you know, dynamic with Tony Martin was falling off a cliff, to say the least, because only a year later we would get Forbidden. The riffs and transitions on here are just at best make me go, neat. But even then, that's as far as it goes, because honestly, after 3 listens or so, I can't really begin to list a single track off this album that would, you know, be a standout among Black Sabbath's entire discography, and that would, you know, elevate this album to the standards that would make it one of the better albums in their discography. It just really doesn't have much going for it.
Yeah. My favorite track on 7 Star is 7 Star. The worst track is Danger Zone.
My favorite track on Cross Purposes is, I fucking scrolled by accident, is maybe Psychophobia. My least favorite track is Dying for Love.
Alright, moving on to our number 12 picks. I chose Dehumanizer.
I chose Technical Ecstasy.
Dehumanizer is a moment in Black Sabbath's career where a familiar lineup reunited after a very long time. Note, the lineup in this case was Vinny Appice returning on drums, Geezer Butler returning on bass duties, and Ronnie James Dio coming back again for vocal duties. It's also an album that saw Black Sabbath kinda go back to their style of trad doom metal and experiment a little with some groove metal on here, on the final track especially. But as a whole, I don't find it overly interesting. You know, it's nice that Dio has returned to the band at this time, but I feel like this is easily the weakest album he's been on. He isn't performing to the best of his ability on Dehumanizer, in my opinion. His vocals are good, don't get me wrong, but it just sounds kind of tiresome with how little variation there seems to be across the board. Plus, the songwriting can range from pretty average to very fucking abysmal on this thing. The instrumentals are fine for the most part, and ultimately they're listenable, but they're not that interesting for how long they go on for. Like, oftentimes we'll get a cool riff and a nice solo, but outside of that, it's just nothing. The track list is mediocre at best. We get some decent cuts, but we also just get some absolutely boring and dreadfully monotonous cuts that drag on for way too long. Plus, for me, it just kind of seems like they're playing it a little safe, and I suppose in that regard, yeah, that's probably mostly why I didn't really care for it. So yeah, that's all I have to say about Dehumanizer.
I went with Technical Ecstasy, and again, very going to keep this very brief because I don't really have a lot to say about this project. It sees, for the first time in the band's career, metal kind of just take the back seat, as this is just a straight up generic 70s hard rock record, and one that would have honestly been just completely forgotten about and not remembered in any way, shape or form, either positively or negatively, if it wasn't a Black Sabbath album and if it wasn't under the Black Sabbath name. It's just uninspired, it's unimpressive, it's serviceable, sure, but it really doesn't do anything exciting, redeeming, special, and honestly worth talking about.
Yeah. Best track on Dehumanizer is Buried Alive. Worst track is Time Machine.
Best track on Technical Ecstasy is You Won't Change Me. Least favorite track is Rock and Roll Doctor.
Oh god, Rock and Roll Doctor.
You just know by the title that it's not going to be great.
It's a fucking boomer fest, man. Okay, so moving on to our number 11 picks, I chose Tear.
My number 11 pick is Tear as well, actually.
While I don't find Tear to be all that interesting or even that good, I find it to be the least dull album out of all the ones from this era of Black Sabbath's music. It has its issues, of course, like most of the instrumentals aren't all that interesting, the songwriting isn't that interesting, and the vocals are pretty nondescript and somewhat derivative, but that's it to me, as I suppose it has some qualities. You know, I enjoy the energy of the album. Granted, it's not the best in their catalog, and it doesn't stand out that much, but it's decent most of the time. The riffs and the guitar work is good. I like a lot of the drumming too. The vocalist matches the energy with I suppose, like very large performances on these tracks. He does good enough, like I mentioned, but he's pretty derivative. First two tracks are really good, and the rest are serviceable, but it's just an inconsistent album in general. I'm fine with this being a step up from a lot of the other albums in this era, but you know, I'm not expecting much of anything like from this album. If I ever, why would I want to go back and listen to it? Actually, the fuck, yeah, it's just another boring Black Sabbath album. It's all right. I'm okay with this. Let's go.
Yeah, again, I haven't really much to say. Tear is definitely raw, and it definitely is heavy metal, which I think for me personally kind of brings it up above a lot of the plain hard rock records automatically. But you know, it just really, in my opinion, sees the band kind of playing things very safe, and it is a decent album, but in my opinion it's just kind of a worse version of the album that came before it, so I'll kind of go into more detail there. And overall it just feels safe. It's definitely not anything to write home about, both positively or negatively. It just is kind of serviceable, and it just kind of exists, and that's all I'll say.
Alright. Best tracks on Tear are Anno Mundi and The Lawmaker. Worst track is Odin's Court.
My favourite tracks on Tear are Anno Mundi and Jerusalem. My least favourite track is Feels Good to Me.
Oh god. Alright, moving on to we're in the top 10 now, and kicking off my top 10 at 10 is Technical Ecstasy.
My number 10 pick is Heaven and Hell.
Oh, that is a hot take. Oh, damn. Oh, shit. You know, back when I first heard Technical Ecstasy, I actually thought it was a pretty damn underrated album in the band's discography. With more recent listens, however, I don't really think so anymore, but honestly, I still think it's a solid album on its own. Yes, this album has issues, most certainly. For one, there are points where the way Ozzy's vocals are mixed are pretty damn bad. Like, at times they're just so processed and laced with way too much reverb and overly processed effects, or they just sound way too high in the mix. There's a few tracks here, while really good instrumentally, just fail to grab me in any way. And it's alright, the track Bill Ward sang is certainly a song. But outside of that, there's a lot that I actually kind of liked about Technical Ecstasy. For one, despite some of my annoyances with Ozzy's vocals, I really liked him on a few tracks here, especially on You Won't Change Me, which is probably the best track on the album. I think that AOTY is decent. I think Geezer did well, and Bill Ward did well as well. I said, try to say well as many times as you can. Fucking hell. AOTY and Ward especially popped off on this album, in my opinion. I really think that the production is, like, outside of the vocal mixes, I think that just the instrumental production is pretty decent. This isn't really your heavy metal Black Sabbath affair, but I still think there's some interesting ideas, progressions, and passages. Plus, I do heavily respect Black Sabbath for, at this point in their career, still trying to evolve their sound and try new things. To be fair, a lot of it doesn't stick the landing or make for some memorable moments, but this is admirable for me. But I also just wish that there was more to talk about. Outside of that, I just don't think there's too much that I could say about Technical Ecstasy. It's a solid album. I respect it in the grander scheme of Black Sabbath's discography, but it's most certainly a flawed album.
Yeah, I went with Heaven and Hell. And Dio was probably just about the best choice for a replacement for Ozzy that the band could have went with. And honestly, I've little to no complaints with his performances or anything. Aside from, a few cases of incredibly cheesy songwriting. But the band, while certainly a little more rejuvenated than they were on Never Say Die, which isn't saying much, or even on Technical Ecstasy, they still instrumentally, to me personally, just sound like a shell of their former self. Just like a lot of the albums I've already talked about, I think that a lot of the instrumentals on here are quite serviceable, but nothing more, nothing less. They rarely manage to excite me in any way. And, it really just gets the job done. I think the only reason I would ever really come back to this project is for Dio's performances. But still, overall, I just don't think it lives up to the better Black Sabbath albums at all.
Okay, some of my favourite tracks from Technical Ecstasy are You Won't Change Me and She's Gone. The worst track is It's Alright. Don't worry, Bill, it's alright.
My favourite tracks are Children of the Sea, Heaven and Hell, and Die Young. My least favourite tracks are Lady Evil and Walk Away.
Alright, moving on to number 9 picks. I chose 13.
I chose Headless Cross.
Wow, that's really high, damn. Okay, so 13, the final Black Sabbath album, and the one that saw the return of their most of the original lineup, including Geezer and, of course, Ozzy. 13 is pretty much Black Sabbath taking fans back to the sound of their early 70s sound, and while it may reside too much in that lane, might I say, without making it fresh, I honestly do think that there's some great tracks on 13. I generally think that it's a solid album, and it's a solid send-off to the Black Sabbath legacy. It's not really much of a secret that Ozzy's vocals have taken a turn for the worst in recent years, and while it's not that noticeable on here, I still think that there is moments where, Ozzy does kind of sound a bit weird, but I can give it a pass since he actually sounds decent on a few tracks here. As for the rest of the band, I think that Geezer Butler is back at his best with some really great present bass lines on a few tracks. I think Tony Iommi does well riff-wise. It's nothing too original for him, but there's some sick riffs on here, and the drumming is really tight and it's very appropriate, and Brad Wilk, who is of Rage Against the Machine fame, was drumming on this album, and he fit what Black Sabbath were doing here, so kudos to him in that regard. The album's production is solid. I feel like the band's modernization of their OG sound is done tastefully. The main issues I have with the album, though, I would say is I guess something a bit more fresh in terms of direction would have been nice and probably would have broken up some of the monotony. There's some tracks that drag on a bit too long for me, and like I mentioned, some of Ozzy's vocals are a bit iffy. But outside of that, I think this is a decent farewell to Black Sabbath's legacy. It's not perfect by any means, but it's good for what it is.
Yeah, my my number 13, you said under unpopular opinion. I actually think this album is quite solid. I'm talking about Headless Cross. If Tears saw the band, simply playing to their strengths, I think Headless Cross is just a better and more exciting, in my opinion, example of that. It's honestly quite solid from start to finish. I don't think it's amazing or anything like that, but I think unlike a lot of the later Black Sabbath albums, to me it really does a lot right. The atmospheres especially here are quite dark and brooding and really entrancing and entertaining. And the instrumentation, while not groundbreaking, definitely scratches an itch that a lot of later Black Sabbath albums just really failed to. And I think the instrumentals, again, while not incredibly complex, definitely add to the atmosphere of this album. And yeah, it's probably, in my opinion, the darkest album the band have released since maybe even like Master of Reality. Tony Martin, for once, really genuinely fits well here, in my opinion. And yeah, it's just a solid album from start to finish. Probably still not one that I'm going to go back to over, a lot of their more classic and better albums, but I think it's easily the highlight of the Tony Martin era of Black Sabbath for me.
Fair enough. Some of my favourite tracks in 13 include God Is Dead, Zeitgeist and Loner. The worst track is Dear Father.
My favourite tracks rather on Headless Cross are Headless Cross and When Death Calls. My least favourite track is Call of the Wind.
Moving on to our number 8 picks, I chose Black Sabbath Volume 4.
I chose 13. That is low.
I know, innit? I have a hot take for one, Sam. Okay.
Oh.
Volume 4. I like Volume 4. I think it's a good album still, and I do enjoy the band still trying to toy with their sound more, and which they did. And while I don't think it's as great as some of the band's best records, I still think it's good and it has its qualities. To start, the performances here are solid. I think everybody did well in that regard, especially Ozzy Osbourne and Tony Iommi. Iommi is still creating some great riffs and great solos, really showing he's the driving force behind the band's music at this point. Ozzy's vocals are great throughout the entire album, and he shows he's a lot more emotive of a singer as well on here, I'd say. That especially is apparent on the admittedly corny Changes, but I still really like that song. It's easily one of the band's more unique and emotive songs, I'd say. It stands out for sure. I think the different tracks on here are welcomed in the track list and act as some of the highlights of this album, like the aforementioned Changes and Laguna Sunrise. There's also your standard heavy Black Sabbath numbers that I think are great, like the iconic Snowblind. If you didn't know, it's a reference to cocaine. And the multi-phased Wheels of Confusion, the Straightener. And for the most part, the production is really solid. This album is without its issues, however. For one, there are moments in the production that admittedly feel a bit cluttered, like in the track Supernaut, which would have been a really great track if the production was better, in my opinion. And there's a fair amount of your standard Black Sabbath heavy numbers that feel kind of watered down, very standard and kind of redundant for them. Black Sabbath themselves took the helm at producing this album, and behind the scenes stuff around this album was very nasty, so it kind of makes sense in the way that some of this turned out. Plus, I just feel like I just feel like it generally doesn't have the same staying power that some of their absolute best records did. It's good, but not that good in comparison. So yeah, I do like Volume 4. I do think that it's a good album, but it's flawed.
I went with the band's final and most recent album, 13, released in 2013, and obviously the main reason this album is so significant is, of course, it's their final album, but also it saw the return of Ozzy Osbourne as lead vocalist for the first time in decades. And if that isn't the perfect selling point for this album, I really don't know what is. The question is, does this project live up to the band's big 6 albums from their early days? Well, in my opinion, not really. But what it does deliver is, I think, a helping of their original sound in a way that is admittedly a little tame, given the band's age, and admittedly it is a little bit of a fan service fest. But I think it's still satisfying nonetheless, and it still was a very fun and cool thing to hear. And I think that's the selling point of this album. It's just, you kind of know what you're getting into. It's kind of the band's send-off. They're just going to play to their strengths. They're going to deliver the sound that made them famous. And, it's meant to you're meant to have a good time with it. And that's all this project really serves. However, I do think that, it still has a lot of really good qualities to it. while Ozzy's best years may have been long behind him in 2013. And, you know, despite the fact that his speech was oftentimes unintelligible at that point, he was somehow able to channel a lot of real emotion and perform vocally in a way that, you know, a lot of artists could never even hope to achieve, let alone in a state that is well past their prime. I think Ozzy still, for the most part, is a very good vocalist. And, you know, just like you said, there's some really odd moments when it comes to his vocals. But I feel like that's something that is inevitable, and I easily can look past that. It's definitely not the Ozzy Osbourne we heard in the early 70s. You know, considering his age, it's still very impressive, and considering everything he's been through, he still puts on one hell of a show. But yeah, the rest of the band, I think, also kind of kicks things up a notch after a streak of almost 40 years where almost everything they've released was just kind of okay to bad. And yeah, it's just maybe it was Ozzy's presence just being back in the studio, but this album to me is a blast. I don't care if it's because it's kind of fan servicey, but I really do enjoy a lot of what's on this project, even if I can understand that objectively it's still far from perfect.
Alright. So my favourite tracks from Volume 4 are Wheels of Confusion, The Straightener, Snowblind, and Laguna Sunrise. My least favourite track is Saint Vita's Dance. I hope I said that right.
My favourite tracks on 13 are Damaged Soul and Dear Father. My least favourite track is Loner.
Right, moving on to our number 7 picks, and I chose Sabbath Bloody Sabbath.
I chose Dehumanizer.
Alright. At this point in the band's career, they were just getting, I guess, worse and worse with their lifestyle and the state that they were in. Because it was far worse than what it was in Volume 4's recording, supposedly. And you can kind of hear that catching up to them on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath in a way. But to be honest, I still really like this album. There are things that I will admit about this album, though. For one, the production isn't as great as what came before. It's not really that heavy, and it more so makes this album a straight up hard rock album rather than a heavy metal album. The songwriting definitely isn't amazing or as interesting as what Ozzy era Sabbath did before it. And there are a few songs on here that do feel a little cookie cutter for them. But to be honest, I really like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath despite my criticisms, and I genuinely think that it's a very good helping of hard rock that sees Black Sabbath still getting a bit more expansive with what they try to do. For one, you can hear tiny elements of prog being applied into what's going on compositionally, and even in some of Tony Iommi's guitar work. The band adapted to something that feels a bit more akin to, I guess, traditional American hard rock as well, and I think that the band makes some really great tracks out of it. Ozzy Osbourne sounds very passionate, and he makes some really great hooks and vocals for a lot of this album. I also like how he kind of toys with his inflections on here too. And as a whole, I think that there's some really great tunes to be found on here, and I can appreciate the variety that was shown from the band here. It definitely has its weak moments, but I found myself enjoying a lot of this album. I think that it's a solid rock album on its own, and I think that it's another good one from them.
I went with Dehumanizer, which, in my opinion, you know, even though I was a little lukewarm to indifferent on the band's previous output with Ronnie James Dio at the helm, I think that the second time around things worked out a lot better for me personally. Wow. Dehumanizer is just an absolute heavy metal blast. It's one of the most fun and exciting albums the band released in decades, and it's, in my opinion, the best album the band have released after their big six. It really sounds like, you know, the whole band have, you know, a purpose on this album. They're playing with more focus and more passion than they have in years, and I think the instrumental work on here overall is a lot better suited for Dio than any of the tracks on the previous albums that they recorded with him. Overall, I mean, I just think it's a really fun album, and I think it does things right when it comes to the heavy metal formula and when it comes to Black Sabbath collaborating with Dio.
You are a strange man, my friend. You are a strange man.
I'm not saying anything about your last two inclusions, so shh.
No. Okay. Alright, my favourite tracks on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath are the title track, Sabra Cadabra and Killing Yourself to Live. Worst track, A National Acrobat.
My favourite tracks on Dehumanizer are Computer God, TV Crimes, and Time Machine. My least favourite track is Buried Alive.
Moving on to our number 6 picks, I chose Sabotage.
I also chose Sabotage.
Hell yeah. Finally, we agree.
Yeah. Wow.
Alright, Sabotage for me is probably the last great album in the classic Ozzy Osbourne era of Black Sabbath's discography. It's an album that has some serious quality to its name, and its performances are great as well. It's another one of those albums where I say don't let a terrible album cover fool you, because this is actually a really damn good album. Sabotage saw the band get back on track with better production, better compositions, and just better and more memorable songs in the track list. The sound feels more crisp in comparison with the last 2 albums that preceded Sabotage, and there's genuinely some creative and inventive moments across this album. For one, the band's more progressive influences are getting stronger and stronger, with more lengthy song structures and additions of instrumentation here and there. The production feels crisper and more heavy, while also having moments that feel kind of easy to get into and accessible. And there are some absolutely fantastic riffs from Tony Iommi across this album, like Hole in the Sky and especially Symptom of the Universe. That riff is proto-thrash if I've ever heard it. Ozzy's on an absolute roll in this album too. His performances are so out there and absolutely electrifying. His presence is more front and center, and he surely wants you to know that, since he's pretty much just shouting most of the time. Not to mention, there's some fantastic moments of drumming and bass work from Bill and Geezer. The tracklist run from the 1st to the 6th is incredible to me. It has some of Black Sabbath's best material on here. It has some great jams. It has some, I think the really short but sweet acoustic track, Don't Start Too Late, is really cool as well. It's a really interesting addition. Some proggy moments like the track Megalomania, and the really unexpected and ethereal gothic track Superzar is really great as well. I love them. And all in all, I think Sabotage is great. It's fun, it's electrifying, it's punchy, it's daring, and for me, it's another great record that Black Sabbath have under their belt. And it was, in my opinion at least, the last great album that from the Ozzy era of Black Sabbath.
Sabotage, I think, is through and through a very enjoyable and very fun album, and it retains a lot of the good qualities of Black Sabbath's early material, but ultimately, in my opinion, it's easily the least exciting and least memorable of the band's big 6. Just like the album that came beforehand, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, this album aims to, progress the band's sound in a more progressive direction. But ultimately, I feel like it does a lot right, but I feel like the albums that came before it just saw the band with a little more cohesion, a little more drive, a little more passion, and importantly, a little more direction than this album. I still think that it deserves a spot, in the conversation when it comes to, the upper echelon of Black Sabbath albums, because truly there's a lot of fantastic material on here. But in my opinion, it is just kind of a weaker helping of what was on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. And it does, in my opinion, deliver a lot more of the same. So I'll go into a little bit more detail when I come around to talking about Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. But for what it is, I still think it's a really good album that was just brought down by a little bit of an inconsistency problem, and it just doesn't really seem like the band is. God, I'm not able to talk. My mouth is so dry after last night.
Man, how do you think I feel?
Yeah, we were drinking the night before. We should add that. I'm chugging water. Let me give me a sec.
Same, I have water too.
What was I even saying before I started choking on my...
I honestly don't know. I don't know
either. Oh,
man, yeah, I'm in the fucking Twilight Zone.
I think the biggest flaw when it comes to this project is, to me, it feels like the band are just playing to things that they've already explored and, in my opinion, done better on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. But through and through, still a solid album. Still would definitely recommend, and still one that I have come back to once or twice.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Sabotage are Hole in the Sky, Symptom of the Universe, and Superzar. The worst track is Am I Going Insane Radio.
My favorite tracks on Sabotage are Megalomia, Am I Going Insane, and The Writ. My least favorite track is Superstar.
Alright, we're moving into the top 5 now. And my number 5 pick is Heaven and Hell.
Mine is Sabbath Bloody Sabbath.
So at this point in Black Sabbath's career, the band went through a very major lineup change. Probably one of the most well-known lineup changes in like rock and metal history. And unless you've been living under a rock, that major lineup change happened when the band sacked Ozzy Osbourne over his serious issues with substances. And in his place, the band hired the legendary Ronnie James Dio. This change single-handedly made Black Sabbath sound like a completely different band on their first endeavor with him. And in my opinion, it just absolutely works for them, and they made a really fucking sick album out of it. You know, many vocal lineup changes, in my opinion, can be very hit or miss, since some singers often just like try to emulate whoever came before them or something like that. But in this instance, Dio adds something new and fresh to Black Sabbath. While they do go to a sound that feels like they're more early heavy, like just generally just straight up heavy metal, like very blatant, they give it a new feel and mood because of Dio's very operatic vocals, which are just completely far removed from what Ozzy brought to the band initially. But Dio suits Black Sabbath well on here, and to say that Dio sounds amazing would be still selling him short, in my opinion. The man is absolutely incredible all over this album. With that in mind, too, musically, this album is really great, too. Sure, they may not be anything that's as ever-evolving, unlike some of the albums that came before Heaven and Hell, but it still sounds fantastic in how catchy and entertaining it is. Iommi's riffs are just great all across this album. There's plenty of very sticky riffs and flashy guitar work to be found here, and they suit the vibe that Dio brought to the band fantastically. And both Geezer and Bill do a great job to adding that to the energy and driving the songs forward. There's definitely some tracks that aren't as good as others, admittedly, but as a whole, this album is simply just really fun, very infectious, and as Dio's first Black Sabbath album, it's one hell of a way to make your splash into an already established titan of a band. And generally speaking, I think Heaven and Hell is great. There is one Dio era Black Sabbath album that I prefer, though.
I went with Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, an album which sees the band for the first time, at least to me, in their discography. It sees them venture solely out of the hard rock and heavy metal sound of their first 4 albums, and this project really sees them dabble a lot more with progressive instrumentation and qualities, ones that were also present on Sabotage, and on both albums they do it to very good effect. However, on this album I think things just click a lot better. In fact, and when it comes to any of the projects where the band branches out of their, the sound that they started off with, I think that, I think that this project and the sound that it presents with its progressive qualities, instrumentation, is the most effective, outside obviously the more traditional Doom, heavy riffs, sound of their first 4 albums. I think that this sound is really executed quite well. It's, very fulfilling, and it manages to kind of differentiate itself from the band's earlier albums without really stepping so far outside of their comfort zone and outside of what, people came to expect from Black Sabbath. And in that way, I think they still managed to capture a lot of the same energy they did on their previous 4 albums. I think that the material on here is really good throughout. I'm very happy that they decided to kind of spice things up a notch and, take in new sounds, especially sounds that are a lot more progressive, and I think allowed them to be a little more free and a little more out there with their music and their ideas. And I think that these prog sounds are intertwined seamlessly into, Black Sabbath's already existing sound. Everything on here is just really fun, really exciting, entertaining. The doomy riffs are a little more glamorous this time around. The drumming is very playful and fun. The bass work is just pristine, and Ozzy is Ozzy at his peak. It does have some duds, namely Who Are You, which is probably my least favorite Ozzy period Black Sabbath track. But overall, I still think it's a very good album. It's, in my opinion, a slightly better version of Sabotage. And yeah, it's makes it into the top 5.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Heaven and Hell are Neon Nights, Children of the Sea, and Heaven and Hell. My least favourite track is Walk Away.
My favourite tracks on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath are Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, A National Acrobat, and Killing Yourself to Live. My least favourite track is Who Are You?
Who are you?
I'm nostalgia.
I don't think you are, my friend.
Fuck.
Okay, moving on to our number 4 picks. I chose Mob Rules.
I chose Volume 4. It's fitting.
I'm very aware that I'm in the minority by putting Mob Rules this high, but at this point I don't give a shit. The second album Black Sabbath did with Ronnie James Dio on vocals, and it's also the first album to not feature Bill Ward on drums. Instead, he was replaced by newcomer Vinny Appice, who would work on a lot of Black Sabbath albums, and with Dio as well, actually. And Mob Rules also happens to be my favourite Dio-era Black Sabbath album, and generally it's one that I rate very, very highly in Black Sabbath's discography. In fact, I go as far as to say it's probably the most underrated Black Sabbath album. Sure, it may not be completely reinventing the wheel on what Black Sabbath were doing on Heaven and Hell, and it's pretty much just Heaven and Hell Part 2. But to be honest, I don't really care, because there's just a lot of really great tracks to be found on Mob Rules, in my opinion, and for me, it's just another fantastic helping of heavy metal goodness from Black Sabbath. For me, the songs feel a little more dynamic, catchy, and more exciting on Mob Rules, and that's all thanks to the amazing instrumentation, the killer performances, the amazing vocals from Dio, and the sheer amount of exciting riffs on this album. It has more of an interesting atmosphere, in my opinion, and at points it does feel kind of inspired by a new wave of British heavy metal. It's grandiose and progressive at points too, and all of this and more makes Mob Rules a really fun listen for me. Tony Iommi, once again, is just killing on the guitar work. There's so many fantastic riffs and solos on here. Vinny Appice's drumming is really great on here too. He really makes a good impression on his first effort. Geezer has some really cool moments here as well, and of course, Dio sounds in his element, in my opinion. I mean, there's very little disappointment when we're talking about fucking Ronnie James Dio, but another thing to note is that this is the best he's ever sounded on a Black Sabbath album ever, in my opinion. I know a lot of people will disagree, but fuck you, I don't care. Some absolutely fantastic tracks turn up on Mob Rules. It has some of my favorite Dio-era Black Sabbath tracks on it, and some of my favorite Black Sabbath tracks, period. It has some tracks that I would have in my fucking top 20. Besides that, I have nothing else to say. I think Mob Rules is generally just an amazing album. Well, a great album, and it's my favorite one with Ronnie James Dio on vocals. And yeah, it's at my number 4 spot.
My number 4 goes to Volume 4 of the band's original.
Funny.
Thank you. Of the band's original. Well, actually, it's not a joke because it is number 4. So I'm unintentionally being a hilarious comedian right here.
Le funny.
Yeah. Anyways, the band's original 6th album, Volume 4, is by far, in my opinion, the least immediate album. It's a lot more doomy than the other projects the band released in the early 70s, and a lot more winding and slow burning in its compositions. And I think there's plenty to love about that approach. The instrumentation just delivers fantastic atmosphere, and at time borders on some pretty psychedelic sounds and ideas. Ozzy's songwriting and performances are as solid as ever, and it's overall a pretty unique album among the band's early output. I definitely don't think it's without its flaws, while the overall atmosphere and the overall more atmospheric nature of this album does serve its purpose well. It just also doesn't really deliver as many, catchy and memorable moments as, a lot of their more headbang centric and just lively early output. But I still think it is a very good album, and I still think that even though it does take a little more effort and a little more time to appreciate, it does end up being quite rewarding, and it does, definitely deserve to be among the upper echelon of Black Sabbath albums, in my opinion. Also, there is one fucking dud on this album, and sorry, it's Changes. I think that track is really, really boring.
I get it.
But other than that, I still think it's a really good Black Sabbath album, and it really manages to do something new and something, again, a little more intricate and slow winding with the sound of their early albums without really having to change all that much, because structurally it is quite similar to those albums.
Alright, my favourite tracks on Mob Rules are The Sign of the Southern Cross, The Mob Rules, and Falling Off the Edge of the World. My least favourite track is Slipping Away.
My favourite tracks on Volume 4 are Wheels of Confusion, Supernaut, and Snowblind. My least favourite track is Changes.
We're moving into the top 3 now. And they're all the same ones, buddy. It's just a matter of... No one's absolutely surprised. It's just a matter of which one's which. And we'll find out now, because my
after
number
this
3
break.
Right. We'll be back right after our word from our sponsors. Raid
wait.
Shadow... Okay, let's move on.
Raid sponsors.
Okay, so moving on to our number 3 picks, I chose Black Sabbath self-titled album.
Oh, wow. I chose Master of Reality.
Oh yes. The album that started it all. Not just because it's the first Black Sabbath album, but also because it's the first metal album ever. There's always...
I thought you were going to say, but because it's the first album.
It was the first album ever made.
Black Sabbath invented albums.
Albums didn't exist before 1970. That's just a fact. But this is pretty much noted as being the first ever metal album. And, there's always debate. People always fucking bring up shit that's proto-metal. Like, they'll always just bring up anything. But no, Black Sabbath, it was the first proper metal band, and this is the first metal album ever. Black Sabbath are the reason metal exists, and that was all thanks to their first 3 albums. Their debut especially, since it's the first one, and it set in stone the ideas, tropes, and fundamentals of metal. As far as their debut goes, it was the first Black Sabbath album that I ever listened to a few years back, and I enjoyed it thoroughly then, and I still enjoy it thoroughly now. With the 7 tracks on Black Sabbath, the band created a very innovative, creative, and ahead of its time sound, but the songs themselves are just fantastic on their own. The album is surprisingly diverse in what it tries to achieve, as well as it's drawing from influences of blues and hard rock. There's even some jazz-tinged drumming at one point here, but Black Sabbath take those influences and make them their own, and bringing them into a sound that's more evocative and dark. The first track especially is arguably the first ever doom metal song, and it's an amazing opener. It's easily one of the best openers in Black Sabbath's discography. In a sense, the album does sort of feel primitive to the Black Sabbath we know on albums like Paranoid and Master of Reality, but that doesn't really stop the songs on here from being just as fantastic as they are, and the performances from the band are amazing too. Ozzy Osbourne's very ghoulish and creepy presence adds a ton to the atmosphere of the tracks on here, as he delivers these very evocative satanic lyrics. Tony Iommi's guitar work is absolutely brilliant and incredibly innovative here. Geezer Butler's bass work is phenomenal. This is actually one of my favorite bass albums ever, and mostly because Geezer Butler just gives it his all in here. There's so many standout moments, like the intro to NIB, which is probably one of my favorite bass tracks of all time, and it's actually a personal favorite Black Sabbath track of mine, probably my favorite, at least. And Bill Ward's drumming was fantastic as well. It was very tight, it was appropriate, and it was great. There's so many fantastic highlights on Black Sabbath self-titled. I think that the album is incredibly consistent and consistently fantastic. It may not be my favorite Black Sabbath album, but I consider it as one of their best, and it's an album that I'm pretty fond of in general.
My number 3 pick is the band's 3rd album, Master of Reality. I'm going in order a bit. Just realized. Wait, hold up. I think I went... Yeah, my top 6 is their first 6 albums in order.
Just backwards.
Up to this point.
Fuck's sake, man.
But will that streak continue? Find out after a word from our sponsor.
Raid Shadow! Okay.
Let's do that. I think people will really appreciate if we do a sponsor joke every 2 minutes. Between every transition.
Sponsored by Ishka Irish Spring Water.
Sponsored by Irish Spring Water.
Ishka Irish Spring Water. That's the water I'm drinking right now, at least.
I'm
not
drinking
actually sponsored,
tap
by the way.
water.
Irish tap water,
Finest.
straight from the drain.
All right. Anyways, Master of Reality. Now we're really onto the big boys. Master of Reality is so close to being peak Sabbath. It presents everything that makes Black Sabbath in their early years just a incredible band. Oh God, where do I begin? I'll start with guitar work. The guitar riffing is just absolutely iconic. It's so driving, it's so powerful, so gloomy, at times quite overbearing, but in the best way possible. Bass work is just chef's kiss. Bill Ward continues to be one of the most underrated drummers of all time, with his very punchy and very vibrant yet very intricate sound. The album overall, it sounds a little darker and a little more unpredictable than their previous two records, and maybe anything else that came after. It certainly never fails to keep things exciting and fun, and the whole atmosphere of this album just feels a lot more bleak and at the same time just exciting and enthralling, and it's an atmosphere that you really want to lose yourself in. It's just overall very well crafted, very well executed. Ozzy, as always, it absolutely shines as this kind of beacon of darkness within the music. And the sinister soundscapes of Master of Reality really suit his vocal style a lot. Honestly, I think maybe the biggest and only flaw in this album is the track Solitude. I think that in a vacuum, it's not really a bad track, but it really slows down the flow of this album, in my opinion. But other than that, I really have not a lot to complain about here, because this is classic Black Sabbath in every sense of the word.
Man, I like Solitude.
Nah, you're tripping. I mean, I don't. As I said, I don't think it's a bad track. It to me slows down the.
Sponsored by Black Sabbath, the band. Not sponsored.
I wish.
I fucking wish, man.
We're doing it at gunpoint. Ozzy's in the room with us.
Yeah. He's there. He's holding me at gunpoint. Trust. Yeah. We'll keep going. Shit. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
My favorite tracks from Black Sabbath self-titled are Black Sabbath, Behind the Wall of Sleep, and NIB. My least favorite track is Evil Woman.
My favorite tracks on Master of Reality are Sweet Leaf, After Forever, and Children of the Grave. My least favorite track is Solitude.
Alright, moving on to our number 2 picks. My opinion, Black Sabbath's second best album is Master of Reality.
And in my opinion, Black Sabbath.
Sponsored by Black Sabbath.
Fuck, I really ruined the intensity there, didn't I?
You really did, man. You should be ashamed.
Black Sabbath's second best album is Paranoid.
Whoa!
Yeah.
Wow.
That is.
Oh. Are you okay? I'm.
Oh shit! MickyT died.
I'm actually shocked. What the fuck? Well, I'm not complaining, but man, I'm shocked. I thought that we were fucking shoo-in for number one.
I was waiting for that moment.
I thought we were fucking shoo-in for number one. What the fuck, man? Jesus.
So I will explain my reasoning shortly.
Okay, this better be fucking good. Alright, so, Master of Reality. Black Sabbath's third album is, unsurprisingly, another fantastic album in the band's discography. And it's an album that, to my ears, is really one of their best. It's another album that feels sort of inventive, in that there's some proto-stoner metal on the opening track, Sweet Leaf. When compared to their first two albums, Master of Reality feels a bit more visceral and a bit heavier. Dare I say it's even the heaviest Black Sabbath album, and it has some of the band's best material on here too. Sonically, Master of Reality is very interesting. It's an interesting album in Black Sabbath's discography. Like I mentioned, it sounds like one of their heaviest, and that's thanks to the way that the bass and the guitars were tuned, as well as the way that they were mastered. It sounds massive, it sounds beefy, and it makes for some of the heaviest songs that Black Sabbath have ever made, like Children of the Grave, and especially Into the Void, which is probably the heaviest Black Sabbath song. I like how the album feels a bit more slow-paced and meticulous. I feel like that suits the sonic palette of Master of Reality very well, and it adds to the track's impact for me. Tony Iommi just absolutely goes off on here. His guitar work, as per usual, is just fantastic. I think that's some of the best riffs ever turn up on Master of Reality. Some of his best riffs ever, might I say. Geezer Butler and Bill Ward add a ton to the meat that this album's sound is. Ozzy Osbourne just sounds great on here too. He delivers on some great performances, and there's some fucking fantastic lyrical moments as well, especially on After Forever. And get this, the song Sweet Leaf, it's about weed. Smoke went, sponsored by weed. Crazy revelation, I know. Anyway, this album, it has its mellow moments too, adding a bit more variety and a break from the heaviness, like on Solitude, which, fuck you for making that your least favorite track, but either way,
so, hey.
I like the psychedelic moment. I think it's a nice psychedelic moment. I generally like the psychedelic moments that Black Sabbath went for in their early shit. And, honestly, it's probably one of my favorites on the album, and Orchid is a nice, bright acoustic moment. As far as I'm concerned, Master of Reality does not miss. It's a fantastic album that packs so much punch for its 34-minute runtime, and with that amount of the amount of fantastic material on here, I just have to consider it their second best. There is one more that I fucking adore more, but Master of Reality is just fantastic. What more needs to be said? Now explain yourself.
Right. This album, Paranoid, easily a shoo-in for most people for number one. And while that makes a lot of sense to me, I can definitely see why that would be the case for most people. It just about misses that spot for me. Don't get me wrong, this project it's fantastic. It's an absolute rock and metal staple for the ages. And after all, these rankings just come down to personal preference and personal connection. And over the last 2 months, as I've been preparing for this Worst to Best, there's just one album that has just pulled me towards it every single time I wanted to sit down and listen to some Black Sabbath in my own spare time. I've always wanted to come back to that one specific album. However, second place in terms of, albums that I wanted to come back to the most often was definitely Paranoid. This project is just incredible. Paranoid sees the band doing so much right. Songs like War Pigs, Iron Man, and the title track are perfect. They're iconic in every sense of the word. And it's, almost impossible to think of metal and the early days of metal without immediately thinking of those tracks. They are just such a staple of the genre, even to this day, and rightfully so. And I do believe that this album, in all fairness, did kind of elevate Black Sabbath's sound to one that was more widely accessible, more widely lauded, and just easier to digest for, standard rock audiences. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I just think that this album is a little more cleaned up around the edges, and it definitely owes its legacy to the fact that I think it came out at the perfect time. I feel like the masses were just kind of waiting on something to spice up the blues rock formula, and Black Sabbath delivered in quite the way. This album just rides the line perfectly between music that's very accessible to anyone, anywhere, but still presents just sheer quality, intensity, and just musical prowess above all else. There's few tracks out there that live in the hearts of metalheads across the world more than something like an Iron Man or Paranoid. Yet I don't know how many tracks that I don't know if there's many tracks that both live in the hearts of metalheads across the world and also are often played at like malls and Urban Outfitters. It just kind of shows the just overwhelming, just across the board impact that the band brought on Paranoid. It was an album that I think the people just wanted. It came out at the perfect time. It just brought new life into music, and it's an incredible album without a single dull moment. And it's my second favorite Black Sabbath album, but admittedly, that is just down to personal preference.
I won't kill you now. Okay, fair. Okay, it's fine though. You have it number 2. I have no reason to be upset. No. All right. So my favorite tracks from Master of Reality are "Children of the Grave," "Solitude," and "Into the Void." I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks on Paranoid or Warpig's Paranoid and Iron Man. Who could have guessed?
Who could have
anyways,
guessed?
No least favorite tracks.
Okay, number 1, in my opinion, is Paranoid.
My number 1 is Black Sabbath's debut.
I would have agreed with you a few years ago, because that used to be my favorite.
Well, we've swapped.
Yeah. Okay, let's cut right to the fucking chase, man. Paranoid is, in my opinion, the absolute best Black Sabbath album, and Paranoid is a masterpiece. It's one of my favorite albums of all time, and it's just an incredible feat in music history. You know, it's incredible to me. It's incredible to me that Black Sabbath came out with Paranoid a mere 8 months after they released their debut, and in that whole time, they only honed and developed their ideas further into something that's truly just a marvel of rock music. Obviously, some of the band's most famous songs turn up on Paranoid, songs that I have huge nostalgia for ever since I first heard them as a kid. I never grew tired of these songs, but the rest of the album has tracks that are just as incredible. And just the sheer staying power that this album has over 50 years later is just mind-blowing, to say the least. It is amazing in that regard, but the music itself is fucking fantastic. Paranoid is a journey that has some of the band's most iconic material, some of their most memorable riffs, and just some of their best technical proficiency. The album is just filled to the brim with incredible tracks and incredible performances. The instrumentals and the production combine so perfectly that, in turn, that allowed Black Sabbath to make a goddamn masterpiece. Ozzy Osbourne sounds amazing on this album. It's easily the best that he's ever sounded on any record ever. He suits what's going on musically so well, with even more passion than on the debut. And the lyrics here have more of a realistic approach to the topics that we're talking about, like war, drugs, and mental health, etc. Tony Iommi's guitar work is at its peak on Paranoid. He crafted so many iconic and memorable riffs all over this album. The sheer menace of the more doomy guitar work is nothing short of incredible. Bill Ward's drumming is just as sharp as it was in the debut, and they have this big thunderous quality to them on Paranoid that sound absolutely sick. And speaking of sick, Geezer Butler sounds solid on here too. Maybe not that standout as he was in the debut, but he still sounds fantastic and supports the band incredibly well. Every single song on Paranoid, in my opinion, is just spectacular. It's an incredibly well-paced, varied, cohesive, and well-written album that has some of the most creative and grounded ideas that the band had come up with. The band is amazing on this album, and as a result, they created a perfect album, in my opinion. In short, I love everything about Paranoid. It's one of the best metal albums ever made, and it sure as fuck is an easy pick for my favorite Black Sabbath album, let me tell you that.
Right, I went with the band's debut, and let me give my reasoning. The competition for the top spot was certainly there, but for me, it's just their debut is just the most exciting album through and through for me. From day one, from the moment this album opens up, it was clear that the band had something special, something unique, and something no other band had. A dark and twisted energy and a brooding sound that would go on to define heavy metal as we know it. And, the album that started it all just so happens to be the one where I believe the sound is the most raw and most exciting. Sabbath's roots, were always in blues rock. If you look at a lot of this album, it is fundamentally kind of a blues rock album, but those embellishments and those deviations from that formula were what propelled this album to be something a lot more, something that at the time people didn't really have any frame of reference for. And obviously decades later we can look back and pinpoint this as the beginning of a completely new movement and completely new direction for rock music, and the start of what would go on to be an absolute craze when it comes to heavy metal. You know, even though this album, I think that at its core it does present a lot of just blues rock, hard rock values, I think that it still does so much right in those aspects. I think that the vocals are just absolutely fantastic from Ozzy. They sound just so dark, so brooding, so twisted. It just completely adds to the atmosphere of the album and completely helps, portray this very dark and demented and twisted atmosphere that the band were going for in this project. But obviously it's not just Ozzy. The rest of the band are just so musically proficient on here and just so spectacular on here that it really is a magical journey. Tracks like The Wizard and NIB are peak Black Sabbath to me, and the latter, NIB, is also my favorite Black Sabbath track of all time. Just this album, I think the main thing that I think pulls me towards this album, as opposed to Paranoid, is it just sounds that little bit more raw and just that little bit more exciting. And I think the blues rock embellishments that were a little bit more present on this album just sound so damn good with the more metal styles and ideas here. It is a incredible album, and I know it's not gonna be most people's number one pick, but for me it is the standout Black Sabbath album.
Well, I mean, fair enough. just fair enough. Okay. So yeah, with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Paranoid are, well, all of them. Well, some of my favorites are War Pigs, Paranoid, Electric Funeral, and Iron Man. Worst track, I have no least favorite track.
My favorite tracks are Black Sabbath, The Wizard, and NIB, and I also don't have any least favorites.
Actually, no, it was Planet Caravan. That was the one I was meant to say, not Electric Wizard, not Electric Funeral.
Okay.
Okay, we're done here. Black Sabbath's worst to best complete. Well, yeah.
That was something. It's been a while.
It's been a while. We're back in the swing of things, and yeah. So just to get the outro over and done with. Thank you all so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. Shouts out to all the peeps on Patreon who got to peep this early. Of course, as we mentioned in the announcement video, there is a link in the description to our Patreon. There's going to be some tiers there. I don't know them off the top of my head, but you can go ahead and read them yourself, and we would love your support here. But of course, just sticking around and watching our content is also enough to support us as well as that. Obviously, links will be in the description to other episodes of the podcast, as well as the Cassette Tapes Discord, where you can chat with like-minded peeps, as well as us if you're down. We have links to our own individual channels, as well as our Twitch channels and our Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. Oh god, voice. No. And I suppose next episode that you're going to be expecting is going to be a Genre Essentials. We are going to do one on film soundtracks, so be sure to be on the lookout for that. And yeah, I suppose that's it for that. Also, if you want to keep up with us, we do streams the odd time as well. Yeah. So we have song request streams, we have album reaction streams, a lot of which are decided on the Patreon. So if you want some input into what we do for the content, then obviously the Patreon is there. And yeah, thanks so much for watching again. As always, my name's been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
Peace.
Bye.